Welcome to our webinar entitled "A Person Who is a Known Sex Offender and Your Congregation." I am your host, Nancy Kaufman, Interim Denominational Minister of Church Safety for MC USA. And I want to say that this webinar is a part of a four-part series, with the first one being in October, which was entitled "When a Sex Offender Wants to Attend Your Church." And then this one, "To Understanding a Sex Offender." February's webinar will be about victims, survivors, and their experience in a church and how a church can be a trauma-informed church. And then in March, we will do a webinar dealing with a healthy understanding of what it means for forgiveness and accountability. Tonight, I am joined by Paul Unruh and Yolanda Kaufman. Paul Unruh is a retired social worker who worked at Prairie View Mental Health Center in Newton, Kansas for 30 years. While there, he was a part of a team working with survivors of sexual abuse and also with persons who had sexually offended. In addition, he has had 25 years of working with Mennonite Disaster Service as a volunteer and also as a project director. Yolanda is a licensed master social worker. She has 15 years of experience working with boys and men who have sexually offended and or committed emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical violence towards others. Her work also included working with survivors of violence. Specific jobs included being a therapist for the Prairie View Sex Offender Treatment Program in Newton, Kansas, a sexual abuse treatment program in Wichita, Kansas, as well as a director for the Batterer Intervention Program for Offender Victim Ministries in Newton. And due to experiencing a secondary trauma from this work, Yolanda has left full-time work with this population and is currently a hospice social worker. Tonight's gathering is a webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat for you to learn of different additional resources. We welcome your questions and we'll try to get to as many that have been sent to us already when you registered, but please feel free to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions. We will also answer some of your, like I said earlier, your pre-submitted questions as time allows. Disclaimer is that please be aware that this webinar will cover topics related to sexual abuse, which may be triggering for some of us. Your well-being is important, so please feel free to step away or exit the webinar at any time. A recording will be available if you decide to join at a more suitable time. Now I will open with prayer and then I will turn it over to Yolanda and Paul to make the presentation. Let us pray. Oh, great and loving God, we ask that you expand our understanding as we participate tonight in this webinar and to strengthen our resolve to be a healthy, safe church for all. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm Yolanda, and I just wanted to share a few things before we kind of get into our slides that I'm going to share. And that I've been working with Paul. I have the great opportunity to work with him for many years, and we kind of do a conversational process together. So don't be alarmed if all of a sudden I say something and Paul pipes in and says something else. So, and I'll just grateful that you all are here to do this important work, this difficult, complex, um, important work. So I want to acknowledge that. We don't consider ourselves experts. We're kind of providing a basic information framework on this topic. And want to always say that the most important focus is for caring for victims and survivors. That's ultimately where the focus needs to be. And much of this work is about you all educating yourselves and making sure that you all have healthy boundaries in terms of relationships, and that as a collective, we have no more victims on whether it's sexual abuse or all levels of abuse. Paul, anything to add?
Simply that we're only going to get to the tip of the iceberg today. We could talk about this for days and we wouldn't be finished. It's a complex thing. Also, Yolanda hinted at this already. I'd just like to add that in this field, it's my belief there are no experts yet. We need to figure this out together.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So Paul and I are going to go back and forth, sharing information. And our first slide is just the definition of sexual offending, and we just really simplified it. This doesn't make it less of a definition. It's just any sexualized interaction which is unwelcome by somebody else. So if somebody tells you that you've crossed a boundary, they feel uncomfortable about your behaviors, you have crossed the boundary, and you need to recognize and focus on how to repair and learn about what happened. The impact of an assault is not measured by the nature of the act, but by consequences experienced by the victim. So, rape can be seen, well, oh, I didn't do rape, or I didn't do this thing. Well, people can be victimized when there's no contact, and even when there's no interaction. For example, child pornography. So really want to, again, focus on, it's when a person says, I've been offended, their boundary has been crossed, that's what we look at. That's what we focus on. Oh dear. Why won't it?
I'll just read the next slide while Yolanda gets it up. Motivations for sexual offending may include the sexual arousal or gratification itself, especially when the perpetrator believes or experiences no other willing partners to occur. Anger is another motivation. Sometimes an expression of anger comes out in sexual ways, or sometimes the sexual act is even used as punishment. A third motivation of some offenders is to achieve a sense of power and dominance or control of another. And that's especially observed when a person feels powerless in their daily life. The fourth one is reaching for or stealing a sense of intimacy. And of course, this stealing is done in secrecy. We'll talk more about that. And finally, another motivation for sexual abusive behavior may be the endorphin rush, or the thrill of getting away with it, or what we sometimes call cliffhanging. This is the element that that's a key ingredient of a subject we're not going to address tonight, but we'll make reference to. That's a key ingredient of the sexual addiction way of understanding some offenders. Yolanda?
So a significant part of this work and this education is recognizing that people have distorted beliefs that give them permission to do what they do. And they honestly believe that they're not doing anything wrong. They don't see themselves as criminals, and they don't, at the time of the assault, they don't see their behaviors as tactics of abuse. There are many distorted beliefs. Justifying is, I was just teaching her about sex. It's not really sex. Any type of excuse is justifying. So if people, that's kind of can be a red flag in any relationship, kind of excusing away any behaviors that are hurtful. That's not a way to be in a healthy relationship. Blaming, she wanted it too. She didn't stop me. Lying, he enjoyed it too. If there's lying to self and others about anything related to one's life, what they've done, and then minimizing. I was just teasing. They won't remember. I want to read kind of an example of what a pastor may be thinking as they have, maybe in terms of their distorted beliefs of crossing personal boundaries. It could sound like this person saying to a victim, "I couldn't help but notice you. God has shown you to me. I have never felt like this. You are so special." And that kind of moves into that kind of belief system, that kind of talking is what we talk about is grooming, using a relationship with God as this must be okay. So this is, again, like Paul said, this is the tip of the iceberg, but distorted beliefs are a significant part of the offending process, and need to be addressed significantly. You, Paul?
Okay, common offender characteristics may include the following. Secretiveness, that's almost a universal. Very few sexually abusive acts happen with somebody watching or in the presence of others. Sometimes they do recruit somebody to assist them in the act, but those are not as common. In general, many offenders have a controlling nature, or you might even say personality. Some offenders are withdrawn, have poor social skills, so they don't get they're not as capable as perhaps some of us are at getting their social needs fulfilled in legitimate ways. So they go to inappropriate lengths to gain a sense of intimacy. Impulsiveness. I call this the clutch problem. There's no clutch between an impulse and a behavior for some offenders. In fact, maybe a lot of them. Lack of appropriate negotiated connectedness is almost universal, probably not quite. In other words, again, they're not skilled at developing, maintaining age-appropriate and power-appropriate relationships. Impatience. I want it and I want it now. And forget the fact that it's not appropriate to want it from you or to want it from someone else. A blamer. If you had been a better partner, I would not have looked for sex elsewhere. How many times have we heard that, Yolanda? He started it. She dressed provocatively. And sometimes when working with offenders, I would say, therefore, now finish the sentence. Therefore what? So she dressed provocatively, therefore you had no control. That perhaps is self-evident. Many offenders have a general sense of self-centeredness or selfishness. Me is much more important than you, and me is much more important than they. And finally, one not to be overlooked is manipulativeness. Many sex offenders have developed elaborate skills at being manipulative, getting people to do what ordinarily they would not choose freely to do. Not all of these characteristics are present in every offender, but they're the very common ones that we frequently see.
And I just wanted to add a bit more about manipulation, because that's just another significant part of the grooming process. We're not going to talk a lot about grooming, but people will, in a church, they may build a reputation and create a strong social perception of themselves as being an upstanding church member and a nice person in the community. I read that many offenders report that religious people are the easiest people to fool. So it's, because there's this just beliefs that everybody's being honest and everybody's doing what they say that they're doing. In terms of also manipulation, people can just build trust quickly and come across as godly. So it's, yeah.
In fact, my apologies.
Go ahead.
Just to underscore that a bit more, research shows that the incidence of sexual abuse in churches is higher than in the general population. And guess what? And this, I don't mean to offend anybody, but there's some other research that indicates the more conservative the church, the higher the incidence of sexual abuse. And partially, when I first saw that, I thought, what? That doesn't make any sense. But then I began to read more and discovered that a piece of the issue there is a sense of community and safety that's assumed when we're in meaningful relationships. And also the notion that certain kinds of intimacy sometimes give invitations for other kinds of intimacy. For example, we're intimate in Bible study, and we know each other rather well. Sometimes that's, if there's an offender or a person who doesn't maintain healthy boundaries, they can make use of that as a way of getting what they need, what they want, and what they think they need. So it's important to understand that church is not the safest place in our society. We need to take responsibility for that as congregations.
Yeah, and we can't guarantee safety at the church.
Right.
Most sexual offenders are repeat offenders. So right there, you realize if somebody's been caught, most likely this isn't the first time. They're not discovered on the first offense. Many times, by the time the person who offends has been caught, they've established a strong pattern of abusive behavior. And that feeds on prior experiences and offenses. So for somebody to say, oh, I only did it once, this is my first time, we can't believe that.
That raises a big question mark. It's important that we understand that sexual abuse might be understood as a secrecy disorder. Therefore, full disclosure is the beginning of an effective response to sexual offending. Anything short of full disclosure does not serve anyone well. It does not serve the victims well, does not serve the offender well, does not serve the congregation well. Because of that, congregations, families, leaders, others must avoid supporting or joining in the secrecy. If as a leadership in a congregation, I know of sexual offenders and I don't share that with others, or better yet, I don't invite or insist that the offender share it with others, then I become a part of the problem. How many times have we discovered when we work with sexual offenders that somebody else knew way back when and kept it secret? And if I were a congregational leader and joined that secrecy, then I become a part of the problem. Imagine what happens if one of those offenders where I have kept the secret offends somebody else in the congregation. Then I am morally involved in the sexual violation. And that's a very, very sobering proposition from my point of view. So again, I just think it's terribly important that we understand that we cannot, in good faith, make a commitment to offenders to keep their story secret. Now, ideally, if an offender gets it and understands the harm that he or she has done, I realize we're using mostly he pronouns here, but he or she has done, if they really understand the harm they've done, they will be a part of making appropriate disclosure to the wider community of what they've done and what it would take to keep them safe. We'll say a bit more about that later. But the secret disorder and the giving up of a secrecy disorder is actually a lifelong work, both for the offender as well as for those who love the offender.
So you might notice a change in the title of this next section. I added support as a word in the title. So safety, support, and accountability for the offender. For support and accountability of the offender, the offender will participate in professional treatment, including individual group therapy with qualified therapists specifically trained in offender treatment. A significant piece of this whole process is that people who offend, if they believe that they don't need to be accountable for their behaviors, and if they feel like it's okay for them to not be part of an accountability group, that should be a significant red flag for the congregation. And the offender.
No, your slides are up now.
Okay, thank you. So in order for that to happen, the offender, with the help of treatment providers, should develop an understanding of the emotional, behavioral, and relational patterns involved in one's offending. Because understanding that complex dynamic within themselves is what creating a safety plan is based off of. And the offender, with the help of others from the congregation, will develop, can you go one more, Christine? There you go. Will develop and follow a written safety plan as part of the accountability group comprised of members of the congregation. So a safety plan is where the person identifies high-risk behaviors in their lives, high-risk emotions. So high-risk behaviors could be they're drinking, they start isolating, they decide to not go to work. Those could be high-risk behaviors. High-risk emotions could be that they feel like they're constantly angry, they're feeling really depressed. And then relational patterns is kind of going back to what Paul was talking about. You know, how are they spending their days? How are they engaging their families? Are they isolating? So whatever the offender identifies in their lives in terms of these emotions, behaviors, patterns, and also their thinking. We didn't put that in there. Their distorted thinking, their excuses, their lying, all of those are written into a safety plan. So saying, when I feel angry, when I feel depressed, this is what I'm gonna do to be safe. When I think of drinking or drink, this is what I'm gonna do as my next step. And hopefully the steps involved in that safety plan include not only what the accountability group can help them with, but also hopefully if it's needed, the person's choosing to go to AA meetings, and has other support systems in their lives that helps contain them and hold them, because the process of owning one's behaviors and being accountable just to oneself is really difficult, but then to be willing to do it to a support and accountability group is a whole nother thing. And then to have a whole congregation know one's struggles is significant. So it's a lot of work for the offender, but it's key in being safe and being open to people supporting and holding you accountable.
Yolanda, it's a lot of work for the congregation too.
Oh, it's significantly so much work for the congregation. Absolutely. Absolutely. And unfortunately, full disclosure is just the beginning of the work for the offender. Sometimes, you know, they might think they will just tell you what they're convicted of. So an important thing is to ask what charges were filed, because a lot of times people aren't convicted for all the charges that are filed. So instead of them saying, I was convicted of this, you'll want to ask, well, what else were you charged for? Next point. The safety plan was focused on offender having no access to and no control over past or potential victims. So was quite a few questions in the questions that we heard in terms of, you know, can an offender who's been an offender of a child be part of a congregation, or do they need to be with adults? You know, the whole focus is what keeps the offender safe and what do the victims need? And the victims need, that comes first. What do the victims need? How is the congregation going to talk with, support victims to share their stories, even before an offender is given permission to be part of the congregation? That is the most important thing. But then a lot of what we see is offenders, the safety plan is that they will always have somebody with them when they're at church, or maybe they don't go to church and they have a special adult only church that is comprised of congregation members. Next point. Along with the acknowledging the acts, they also need to be able to name the resulting harm experienced by the survivor and victim within the context of the accountability group. And that's focusing on Yeah, somebody can name, I did this to this person, but without understanding the impact, without understanding and be able to verbalize the effects, emotional, spiritual, physical, mental effects on victims. If an offender's not able to acknowledge that and talk about that openly, that's a significant red flag. Next point. And so there's the church supporting the offender if that's what the church decides with the input of the victims. A key piece is also the church engaging with the community, engaging with the treatment provider, engaging with probation officer, and the offender will have to sign a release of information for that to happen, but they would hopefully be willing to do that because it's all part of the safety net to support them and to monitor to their safety and provide accountability. Anything to add, Paul? I got so distracted. I'm so sorry.
That's good for now.
Okay.
Next section is safety and accountability for the congregation. Effective response on the part of the congregation requires a strong partnership be developed between the offender and the congregation. And the safety, the accountability group will develop a safe sanctuary policies. And by the way, for congregations who do not have known offenders in the congregation, this is the time to work on those policies. Safe sanctuary policies and procedures. And so when an offender becomes known, you're already starting behind the 8 ball if you don't have policies and procedures in place. Please do that ahead of time. And in order to speak to complacency in some of our congregations, there are likely unknown offenders in every congregation in our conference. That's not an overstatement. And that gives me a chance also to say that all of this work needs to be done with 2 primary understandings. The first is there are many unknown survivors of sexual abuse sitting in our churches on Sunday morning, and there are many unknown persons who have been sexually offensive sitting next to us in church. How we do our work with the known offenders ought to form a ministry for those 2 subgroups as well. We need to prioritize transparency over liability fears. Once again, I would repeat, do not join the offender's secrecy. That's a disservice to survivors in the congregation. It's a disservice to this offender's specific victim or victims. And it's a gross disservice to the offender himself or herself. I'm going to need to go quickly here, though, so we get to some of the questions. Once again, if leadership joins the secrecy, then there's a strong likelihood they will provide additional harm to both offenders and to survivors or victims. We need to create theologies, education, and practices that stop the perpetuation of sexual violence. And we need to learn we need to learn better about how to teach healthy boundaries, interpersonal relationships. So one day we can go to the mountaintop and say, no more victims. We could talk a month on that subject. Congregations need to be able to recognize and name their own distorted beliefs that have in the past minimized offensive behaviors, or excused them away, or have supported unhealthy ways of relating. Examples might include, well, all he did was, again, remember Yolanda's first slide. the harm caused, the harm experienced by the survivor is the point. That's just the way men are. Oh, that's no big deal. I experience that all the time. He was just teaching her something. She had to learn it somewhere, sometime. Those are all things we have heard way too many times. And each time we hear that in our congregations, that should be challenged immediately. We need to develop an accountability group that supports the offender emotionally and physically and holds them accountable not only for past behaviors, but for present behaviors and healthy boundaries. And we need to monitor the presence and the interactions of the offender so that we can assure that in this congregation there is no access and no control on the part of the person who has offended. And that includes at all church functions, by the way, not just church property. Yolanda, you want to make an addition there anywhere?
Well,
We can talk about it for another
Crystal,
hour.
can you advance all the points on that slide? Make sure we didn't miss anything. We got that one. Got that one. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. That accountability group is a lot of hard work for the group. Well, let's see, where are we? Oh, just a couple of references. Let's see, we're exactly at 6:40, and that's when we were going to go to questions. So let me make just one comment. Gleanings from some cases that we have been a part of or associated with. I have a list of 6 or 8 here. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I will simply say this. The one universal thing in every success story that I've been a part of or have known about is that there's 100% companionship with an informed adult with the offender whenever they are at a church function. And I use the word church in the broad sense of the term. That's the responsible way to proceed. And by the way, if an offender gets it, if they have done their own work correctly, they will welcome that and will feel very positive about that. If they don't, that's a red flag. You better check out what's behind that. We do a gross disservice to offenders, to known offenders, if we leave them alone anywhere in our church life. I know that's a strong statement, but I believe that very strongly. Nancy, you had some questions. Oh, mercy.
Yeah. Just going right sometimes when there's technology issues, and I'm sorry for that, but your PowerPoint will be available as well as a recording of this webinar, along with all the other webinars that we have done in the past and will do in the future. And that is on the Safe Church website. So just so you know that. But yeah, I will ask some questions, and if I ask a question, you feel like you've addressed it, maybe you have one more point you'd want to make on it, or I can yap away too.
Just one addition from my notes that I've skipped over here. I think it's important that the accountability and support and accountability group be responsible to the board of directors, but also to the congregation itself. All of this process requires a series of congregational conversations. I cannot emphasize that strong enough. To your questions, Nancy.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate all the things you said. And I think we said at the very beginning, you folks said it, and if I haven't said it, I meant to say it. This is just basically an introduction. There's a ton more stuff. In fact, we even talked earlier tonight that there could be, you know, a training that could be several hours long that could be useful to churches. But I'll go down some of the questions. One is describe practical strategies for train people who companion a known offender in the congregation. And you said, Paul, one universal thing, if it's going to have a chance of being successful, the accountability group, support group has to be well trained and knowledgeable. But how would you go about doing that? Or can either of you give a few ideas between the two of you of what you might suggest?
Well, I have sent 2 links to you all. If you all type in circles of support and accountability into the internet, there's a lot of information, and I gave a how-to guide, information, and a 10 tips for being effective circles and support and accountability volunteer. So it's not something that you can quickly talk about, because it's a whole understanding of oneself as a support person, as well as looking at the bigger picture. But I think maintaining healthy boundaries is key, whether you're in the accountability group or not. That's what we have to like start from the beginning in all churches, all relationships. And yeah, it's a whole nother conversation. But I added that information that can be a start.
Sure.
Well, and
The accountability group also needs to get to know the offender in additional ways to what they knew before. They really need to have regular contact with the offender, both at planned meetings and incidental. And they need to be willing to ask lots of hard questions. But also, and let's not forget this, the support and accountability group, the support part of that is for the accountability group to put their arms around the offender emotionally in such a way that the offender understands that and feels that. That's a big one, because the more of that's accomplished, the safer that offender will become, and the more you can do other related business along the way. So this is not about bashing the offender or shaming the offender. It's not that at all. It's emotionally and spiritually putting your arm around her or him, and then doing the hard work together. That takes time, effort.
And I will say there are other resources, like I'm familiar with a group out in Pennsylvania. It's called the New Persons Ministry, I believe it's called, that could help congregations understand what they need to do if they're gonna have a sex offender in their church. And I think you did recommend earlier that you do need to have access to an individual's record, that you can talk to the parole officer, or if they're in counseling, that there has to be integrity. You just don't take their word for it. You can't.
Right.
It doesn't help them if you do that. So you got to understand very clearly the understanding of how easily you can be manipulated.
Exactly. That's really important to say. Absolutely. I was going to say something else and I just forgot. Sorry. It'll come back.
Okay. Well, another question is, what would you say to a congregation who the offender and the person say that they raped somebody and they are in the same congregation? Can that stay, or would you recommend that the offender needs to move on? the violator?
When both the survivor and the victim and the offender are in the same congregation. That's very, very difficult. I think there's only one thing, for starters, if the congregation wants to maintain a ministry to both, then they need to separate the offender from the victim for a considerable length of time, so that the informed adults in the congregation could develop a house church model with the offender if they want to. That's one way to go about that, and I have seen that done a time or two in congregations. And then, as Yolanda indicated earlier, that person never shows up at a church function until or unless the victim indicates that she or he is ready for that. And that will be ordinarily, that's way down the road. That's not this Sunday or next.
No, it's defined by the victim.
And it may never happen.
It may, yeah. Just to have it be, oh, it could happen. I would be really hesitant to say that. But it's again, going back to victim focused, survivor focused. What is needed? They call the shots. They have the control.
And not to throw into the victim's face, well, we're all about forgiveness and act as if we go on and forget. That can happen. I have not seen that actually work I haven't seen it work at all. They do usually need to move on from my experience. Do you recommend, well, I guess you did talk about limited someone's attendance to only adult gatherings if they have abused children. And
one of the things that we haven't said, well, I guess not directly, but each situation is it's case by case. You can't make blanket statements about how it looks, because each person, each congregation, each offender, each victim, each is all different. And if I had to say what is best practice, it would be that the person, it doesn't go to the congregation, but it's all about the congregation having conversations and deciding what makes people safe, how people in the congregation already feel safe, and then let the offender know. The offender doesn't have an option to drive the process or influence the process.
Another question that was asked, and I'll sort of say this, we often hear from offenders. That was a long time ago. That was 20 years ago. I just heard that this week. That was 20 years ago. I've changed. Nobody is perfect. Where's forgiveness and grace? What would you say to that?
Well, I'd take a deep breath, or I just did. If an offender would say that in my presence, I would say, therefore what? What's your point? And then I would say, what harm was done and what's happened in the meantime, from the victim's point of view, again. And grace, if I'm a victim in a congregation and a known offender walks in, my trauma is much more likely to be triggered than not, even if this offender had nothing to do with me. And if an offender really gets it, he or she will understand what a powerful, triggering symbol they are. And on the subject of grace, if an offender really understands, they will extend grace toward the victim's experience. Now, in the final sense, I think I wasn't going to tell this story, but maybe I will. Our best friend for a major part of our life has been a couple who lost a daughter after sexual abuse became known, and she died. During the healing process for our dear friends, they gave me the hardest assignment of my lifetime when they said one day during their healing process, this was a year or two after the death of their daughter, said, "Would you write a prayer in behalf of offenders?" And I said, "What?" Well, to make a long story short, I did. But it was not easy. But I ended with this, and in the prayer, I had 8 or 10 verses, help them to take responsibility, help them understand the harm they've done, help them to make reparations where possible, help them, whatever, help them to learn the benefit of good boundaries, healthy boundaries, all that kind of stuff. And then I concluded with a line something like this: "And there, dear God and Creator, may we meet them at the foot of the cross, where each one of us is in need of God's amazing grace." But until then, let's not re-victimize anybody.
Thank you. Another question, I'm going to sort of combine a couple of them together because they're sort of similar, but and you did talk about secrecy, but someone brought up the idea that Megan's Law in public. Is it legal to let the church leaders know, or others? And along with that, someone asked, if the offense was against children, how transparent are we expected to be? Should we disclose to families in the congregation? What if the offense happens, at church? How much do we disclose? And then also, if the person were to leave the church, the offender leave the church, how responsible are we to inform the other churches in the community? That's a big mouthful.
Good questions. Go ahead, Yolanda. I saw your finger.
No, that was pointing at you. It's your answer.
Oh, mercy. Yes. First of all, if the offender wants to be a part of the congregation where I'm going, they better be willing to disclose and make those disclosure themselves. That cuts through all this other crap about who should disclose what to whom. If the offender gets it, understands the harm he or she has done, has repented, and wants to do what's right for his or her community of faith, they will do the disclosing, and they'll consult with leadership about how to do that appropriately. There are releases of information that can be obtained from offenders. That's an avenue that will work sometimes, not in others. Nancy, bring us back to the core question, the part of the question I've missed.
Well, I actually had to, I had a situation, had to deal with this years ago where the past, well, and even just recently, the pastor knew and, but didn't want to tell the whole church. And so there were a lot of potential, possibility of a lot more victims because people don't know. The one church I remember when a parent found out that there was a sex offender of children in the congregation, and the congregation hadn't been aware of that, was extremely angry at the church and didn't trust the church because the church didn't help them as parents to protect their children. It's one thing you say, and oftentimes offenders will only acknowledge what you have found out. Like you even said earlier, that the time that they are actually caught, that most likely isn't the first time. And if it's happened a long time ago and they say they've never done it again, it's not always true, but a lot of times it's true that unless there's that, strong accountability in there, they will offend again. And so how do we provide a safe place in the church if we're the secrecy? There's one thing about confidentiality, but there's another thing about secrecy that it kills the life or, the very soul sometimes of the victims and survivors in the church. It also can kill the life of the church because they're trying to hold this secret together, and some know and some don't. And that is to the advantage of the offender.
Yes.
Right. And Paul talked about the secrecy before, like there should be no secrets. The information should be shared with everybody. If the offender is going to another congregation, the other congregation should be notified of the behaviors. The person is past the ability to have that with information withheld, because they have to focus on no more victims as opposed to protecting the offender.
And our church, not just our church, but churches in general, have been known to be enablers of abuse.
Yes. Yes.
And that's a piece
up. And that's a piece of the confession that we need to do as congregations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
just one additional comment. I've heard a bunch of lectures recently on the concept of Anabaptism and some of the early churches. This business of the offender confessing and making known what he or she has done, that's very Anabaptist. That's what was expected of our church, of church membership, historically. And we've lost some of that. It's perhaps time that we go back and reclaim that, so that we can really continue to be the church again.
Well, we have come to 8 o'clock. There's so many more questions that were here. Some of them can be picked up in the next couple of webinars. We do have a webinar on our website about grooming if you want to learn more of that. And then, I talked about our October, last October, when a sex offender wants to attend your church. Not every church has the capacity or the energy to take on one. And I know somebody in our question said, yeah, but they all need a church. Yes, but that doesn't mean that your church in particular may be the right one for them because you have other issues you're dealing with, or you have so many survivors, victims in your church, whatever. So thank you, both of you, for sharing out of your life's experience. And to those of you who sent questions, I'm sorry we don't have all the, weren't able to answer all of the questions, but if you want to contact me at Safe Church, I'll try to do the best I can to connect you to some other resources or whatever. And this webinar will be on our website, and it is free as a resource. So anytime you want to listen to it again, you're welcome to do that. I would like to close with a blessing to all of you. I have been impressed with how many people in the church care about this issue and are dedicating themselves in their own particular congregations to help to make a safe place for all. And that includes, you know, offenders. Anyway, so I want to thank you for being here, and the blessing that I offer you is that may God give you all you need to do what you need to do in your ministry and in your congregation, in order that we may all live in a safe space. So blessings to you, and go in peace.